Hello students, and today, as you already saw, we have a very interesting topic that I would like to present, and it's one of the most important works of Durkheim called as Suicide. Now this particular work of Durkheim was published in 1897, and again this particular work of suicide fortifies Durkheim's idea of sociology, and especially the subject matter of sociology. And more than that, he also provides us with a proper methodological orientation that a student of sociology or a social scientist should be using in the study of social facts. And thus, he showed to the world that an individualistic phenomena like suicide could be studied by the discipline of sociology. So as you see here, I have already introduced you, and then I'll take you to the definition of suicide, talk about the main purpose of the study, and then speak about the main aspects of this study and the classification. So as you see, this book I said was published in 1897, and it's a monumental landmark in which conceptual theory and empirical research are brought together. And that is what I said, that he presented a precise understanding of the subject matter of sociology and backed it up with a proper scientific investigation that could be taken up as part of a social scientist in the field of sociology. And this work is clearly showing us the evils of modern industrial society, and his emphasis was on anomie. So for him, suicide is an indication of disorganization, both individual and society. And the focus which Durkheim laid in terms of suicide was not on an individual act of suicide, but rather at the suicide rate. And therefore, increasing rate meant that there was something wrong in the social system, or wherever the rates of suicide increased in a given societal context, there was something wrong over there. Going further, let's look at the definition of suicide. As you see, Durkheim defined it as every case of death resulting directly or indirectly from positive or negative death performed by the victim himself and which strives to produce this result. It's very clearly that it is directly where an individual takes one's life. But the other point that is of great significance here is when you look at indirectly, death resulting directly, indirectly. And the other aspect to that is positive or negative death. So the consequence of the death being both positive or negative and being indirect is what something very striking in this definition of suicide. And we will see in a later point of time that how these 2 points which I emphasized here are of great significance when you look at Durkheim's work of suicide. So it is clear from this definition that suicide is a conscious act and the person concerned is fully aware of its consequences. Going further, the 3 main purposes of this study. First, suicide was not an individual act, but an act caused by some power which was over and above an individual. Here Durkheim is bringing his idea of social fact again and trying to fortify this idea as a subject matter of sociology. So it was not the personal situation, but the manifestation of social condition that contributed to suicide. 2, Durkheim wanted to prove that the act of suicide was beyond the explanation of heredity, climate, or psychological factors. There were many who portrayed suicide in this light, that it's sometimes hereditary, or it is because of psychological conditions that causes it. But Durkheim wanted to show that it's not merely an individual act, but it is beyond that. It cannot be explained simply by heredity or climate or psychological factors, but you needed a greater, in-depth and a comprehensive approach towards the understanding of a phenomena like suicide. Durkheim chose the statistical method in order to prove this, as he wanted to prove the scientific way why people committed suicide. And secondly, the explanation by psychology was inadequate. Experiments on suicide was not of any question, and case studies would be of little use as they could not provide reliable generalizations, and the survey method couldn't be used as one cannot survey the dead. And therefore he used the statistical method to check the rates and look at the different reasons why the people committed suicide. And in doing so, he was able to give us a proper, comprehensive understanding of the phenomena of suicide, although being individual, but he traced it to the social reality. So as you see here, for him, suicide is an index of the decay in social solidarity. Again, his idea of social solidarity that is taken from his thesis when he talks about the centrality of the thesis of division of labor is about social solidarity, what holds people together. And you see here in his empirical findings, he would support this claim, and he researched different groups, examples and religious groups, and he found that the Protestants were more likely to commit suicide than Catholics. People in large cities more likely than in small communities. Again, people living alone were more likely. Thus, depending on how well an individual was integrated into the social bond with others, it would determine suicide. And thus, he could come up with certain generalizations on this. As you see here, Durkheim concluded that there was no society that suicide did not occur, and its so the regular occurrence was considered to be as normal. And as you see here, but if there was a sudden increase in the rate, then it would indicate a decay in the social solidarity, as it would be an indicator of the disintegrating forces at work in social structure. So suicide, though an individual act, it could be understood fully only by the reference to the social context in which it took place. And thus this takes us to Durkheim's findings and his classification of suicide. And this is very interesting. So as you see here, Durkheim gave us a fourfold classification of suicide, and it's very simple to understand from this. You see here, the fourfold classification was egoistic, anomic, altruistic, fatalistic. Let's look at egoistic and altruistic. Egoistic was based on the lack of integration of a person in the society or in the people whom they consider as the significant other as well as the generalized other. So the lack of integration causes the egoistic suicide, whereas a high integration resulted into altruistic suicide. High integration, which meant that you were highly integrated, you were so strongly as part of the society that you could do anything for the society, and therefore it was called as altruistic suicide. And the other part of it was the anomic suicide, that is lack of regulation, and you find the opposite of that is fatalistic. It is the high regulation. So on one hand you have the lack of regulation, that is a situation of normlessness, a situation of a total breakdown in the social laws or different things that govern people that would contribute to suicide. and you also have over-regulation. It's a high regulation that contributed to people taking one's life when they could not fit into the expectations of the people. So let's have a look at each of these in a little bit of a minute detail. So egoistic suicide, when men and women are not sufficiently integrated into the social groups, they are prone to egoistic suicide. It takes place as a result of extreme loneliness or excessive individualism. When one becomes detached from the society and the bonds that held him together with others become loose, they are more prone to egoistic suicide. And you will see that the egoistic suicide committed by those who have a tendency to shut themselves up, who take blame on themselves, and who in a way they lack that integration with their family, with the people whom they are close to, or with the society by and large, and they would blame themselves for it. And Durkheim thus studied varying degrees of integration of individuals into their religion as an example, and also political and national communities, and found that there was less integration among Catholics compared to Protestants, and therefore there was high tendency that Catholics would, sorry, I did a mistake, there was, less tendency among Catholics to commit suicide compared to that of Protestants, because Protestants had lack of integration with the religion. And hence Durkheim generalized that the lack of integration is the main cause of egoistic suicide. And as we look at the opposite of egoistic is the altruistic. In this case, suicide takes place in the form of a sacrifice in which an individual ends his life by heroic means so as to promote a cause or an ideal that is very dear to him or her. It results because of over-integration of individual into his group. And thus what you see here is a high level of social solidarity which induces this type of a suicide. So over here people are so very strongly integrated into their society, or the people who are close to them. They are ready to do anything for them, so much so also sacrifice one's life. And thus, as you see here in Japan, an example of harakiri, wherein some Japanese take their life as they believe self-destruction will prevent the breakdown of social unity, or sati in India earlier, where a woman, if she willingly jumped into the fire, the self-emulation of Buddhist monks and self-destruction to achieve nirvana are some of the examples where a person who takes one's life for a high ideal, and thus humans always ready to sacrifice one's life for a great cause is a classic example of altruistic suicide. The word altruistic, alt, which means high. Going further, as you see, this takes us to the next two classifications of suicide, that is anomic and fatalistic. So as you see here, anomic suicide, when the group fails to give the individual enough regulation and guidance, man or woman are susceptible to succumbing to anomic suicide. So here it would mean a total breakdown of social norms, and sudden social changes in the modern times encourage anomic suicide. And what happens here is that is the breakdown of the collective conscience, and as a result human beings fall victim to anomic suicide. Like the present pandemic situation is a classic example, it would mean, of a breakdown of the social norms, and or maybe what hold people together is being broken down. So without the social backing to which one is accustomed in life, one would find it difficult to survive and thus would take one's life. And looking at the fatalistic suicide, you would see when the group gives the individual over-regulation and guidance, man or woman is susceptible to succumbing to fatalistic suicide. This happens because of excessive norms and rules. And here the collective conscience is so strong that it is extremely binding on the individual. That means here again you will see the idea of social fact as something that is external to you, and there is excessive coercion on you if you don't fulfill certain conditions or you don't meet up to the expectations. Then you will feel not worthy to live your life because you don't suit or fit into what is being expected of you, and you will take your life. And this is very fatal. And I would like to make you think of more examples in relation to all these 4 types of suicide, and help me understand this even better. With this, I would say thank you, and I hope you understood the different ideas related to suicide and also the reasons for undertaking the study and the classification of